joining in on the call. We're going to get started. So welcome everybody to our PIN debit presentation. This call is being recorded for training purposes for our Ignite Payments agents. If you do not agree with the recording of this topic today, please disconnect from the call now. Thank you guys for joining in on this session once again. Today when we talk about PIN debit, we'll start off with what's in it for me. We'll talk a little bit more about the product overview. I don't know that PIN debit will be something new to anybody on the call, but I think understanding the features and the benefits of debit and how do you position that with your potential merchants might be something new or something that we may not have thought about before. We will also get into discussions about pricing. A lot of that will be left open to you. All right, we'll discuss what your options are, though. We'll look at probing questions, and then there's some scenarios and selling strategies that we'll look at. When would PIN debit seem to make sense with a particular merchant as opposed to when it might not make as much sense? And then we'll wrap up our call today talking about how do you board PIN debit. There's a few other options that are available to you. And, of course, we'll reemphasize that boarding piece later on in the week when we look at the merchant processing agreement and application and ROLA. All right? You'll see it repeated there once again. So we'll touch on it today, and then you'll see it again later. So one of my favorite radio stations, WIIFM, What's in it for me? Is something that you'll see on a lot of our topics that we'll be discussing this week. But it's good to know why would I bother? All right, what is in it for me? We're going to talk about what's in it for your merchants through the features and benefits, but we want to start off at the very beginning as to, well, how does this benefit you guys as an agent? Well, first of all, there are a lot of consumers out there that prefer to pay this way, so this puts you right in line with what's going on in our marketplace right now, and it gives you the opportunity to provide that kind of service to your merchants. It's an alternate method for accepting debit cards. It's true that a majority of the debit cards out there today are transactions where the customer doesn't put their PIN number in, but there will be an opportunity. There may be an opportunity here where not only can we offer PIN debit, but also educate the merchant as to why they would want to be doing this or why they might want to ask their customer for their PIN number. It may decrease their cost for processing. We'll discuss some of that throughout this call. It also may help them with chargebacks. It's something that merchants don't typically look at, or a lot of times other competitors in our market space look at, but it is a problem sometimes for a merchant that they see a lot of disputes, a lot of complaints, customers not recognizing the transaction, saying it wasn't them. That also is another benefit that I think you'll be able to use to help position debit. You can also potentially increase your income with additional terminal sales, peripherals. One thing that a merchant will need if they want to be able to accept PIN debit is either a terminal or a piece of equipment that has a built-in PIN pad, or a separate peripheral, a PIN pad that will allow the merchant to offer this service to their customers, allow the customer to go in and put that PIN number in. So with that being in place, if you can sell debit, it may also lead to additional equipment sales. You guys also do see revenue from PIN debit transactions. So there's those added benefits, okay? And any product or service that you can add to a merchant, it helps us become that all-in-one solution where the merchant can get, not just the Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and American Express processing from us, but, the additional topics that we're going to discuss today all kind of blend together as to, allow that option where, it makes it tougher for our competitors to walk in and try to take that merchant from us. It makes it a little tougher for them just to come in and talk about saving money, lowering their rates whenever they're not just getting the credit card processing from us. We're also providing debit, telecheck, gift cards. So That same concept you'll hear repeated today and throughout the rest of the new agent development program is when we're talking about any kind of product or services. When you start bundling these things together, it creates more value for the merchant that they don't typically get anywhere else. So what is PIN debit? Well, as I mentioned, I don't think that what debit is probably got to be new for anybody here on our call today. We know that it's a form of payment. Many of us out there on the call right now have debit cards in our possession. Whenever agents ask me to take a look at a statement to help kind of do some statement analysis, I notice more and more that close to 50 or 60% of that merchant's volume is debit card, whether it's the PIN number is entered or not. It's a very widely used form of processing, and not just here in the United States. Actually, globally, debit continues to grow. In Canada, for example, the ratio is more like 70 to 75% of a merchant's volume may be debit, where it's pulling those funds directly from that customer's either checking or savings account. Now, in the world today, there are two forms of debit. All right, there's the kind that require that personal identification number, and then there's the type of debit where it doesn't require or the customer may not use that PIN number at all. Okay. Some terms that we usually use for these types of debits are, you'll hear the terms online and offline debit, PIN debit, non-PIN debit. Sometimes non-PIN debit is referred to as signature debit because they're not putting their PIN number in. A lot of times they're going to be signing that receipt just like they would during a credit card transaction. So some common terms that you'll hear this referred to as, but today we're really going to be focusing mostly on the non-PIN debit, all right, and kind of comparing that to, or sorry, not the non-PIN, the PIN debit. We're going to be focusing more on the PIN debit and how that compares to when a customer doesn't put their PIN number in. All right, what are some of the benefits there? And as I mentioned, there's a lot of consumers out there today that prefer PIN debit, and our industry is very much driven by what do the customers want to use. That's, if a merchant's looking at that and trying to make sure that they have those forms of payment in place, those are the merchants that tend to be a little more successful than the ones that are still holding out and restricting a customer from paying the way they want to. Okay. PIN debit is just part of that strategy to say, Mr. and Mrs. Merchant, we want to make sure that you don't have to tell any of your customers no, all right, whenever they want to choose that form of payment. So what is non-PIN debit or signature debit? Well, a lot of us probably use this already today without really thinking about it. If we have our debit cards at the time of the transaction, really treated like a credit card transaction, all right? If you guys have ever used your debit cards on a website to order anything online, chances are you won't ask for your PIN number. You just put in the card number, expiration date, maybe the card code on the CVV2 code on the back of the card, and that's it, right? You can use your debit card to do that. As long as it has a Visa or MasterCard or Discover logo on those cards and are part of those issuing banks, these debit cards don't require a PIN number. It's an option left to the customer, okay? And in this case, with non-PIN, it just means, well, the customer didn't put that PIN number in. Now, as you can imagine, because it acts very much like a debit card, it is also billed very much like a credit card transaction. So when we get to some of the benefits of why a merchant might want to decide to use PIN versus non-PIN is, earlier in the training, you guys should have heard a little bit about interchange and how that works. And you may have noticed on Monday's call with interchange that with credit transactions, interchange will definitely apply. But even with debit cards, whenever the PIN number is not entered, there is that rate and transaction fee, that wholesale cost that the issuing banks will they'll bill us, and of course we typically have to pass that on. PIN debit is a little bit different than that. All right, we'll get into those differences here in just a few moments, but those are some of the details that will hopefully catch us up to speed with non-PIN debit. I think we know what it is, but I think how it affects the merchant, that's the part that we may not have recognized before.
So wait, can I ask a question? This is Heather.
Sure.
Are you saying that the non-PIN debit actually costs?
So what is PIN debit? All right, well, very simply, it's whenever a customer decides to use that debit card and they do put in their PIN number. Most debit cards say this is an option, something that the customer has to do. And if I took a poll of everybody on the call right now who has a debit card and asked, whenever it asks you to put that PIN number in, do you do it or do you just skip over it and let it become a credit card transaction? Okay. I'd be willing to bet that most of us probably don't put our PIN number in. I might be wrong, all right? There might be somebody out there that will do it. I do it. But we're creatures of habit, I think, and if, we go from credit to debit, we just go, I'll sign for it. That's what I'm used to, so that's the way I'm going to continue to go do things. But whenever that PIN number is entered, there's a real-time debit from the cardholder's bank account. They have to have the funds available, otherwise it's going to decline. With PIN debit transactions, you can't do any refunds or voids of that transaction. It's pretty much locked in. The only option there, if a merchant has a customer who has run a PIN debit transaction and they're returning the item, is that they'll either give a cash refund, they'll do a store credit, or they may also give them a gift card, maybe use a gift card as a way of giving that money back to the customer, but keeping that customer in their store, or at least using those funds to continue shopping at their location. So PIN debit, it might be cheaper, but it's a little tougher whenever it comes to returns there and deleting those transactions. It's also a little more difficult for restaurants to adjust those transactions for tips. So there are solutions in place that allow that a little bit easier nowadays. With some of the equipment out there is capable of allowing for pay at the table. So, when you start looking at those types of solutions, they really do allow the full-featured benefits of, letting a customer put in their tip, but also still utilizing their debit card and putting their PIN number in. Most of our restaurants out there today probably don't have PIN pads in place just for that reason that if somebody's going to put their PIN number in, it's tough for a waiter or waitress to come back at the end of the night and then adjust those original transactions for tips. But there are ways around that. Service merchants as well. Hair salons, nail salons, they operate very much like a retail, but they do also have the ability to accept tips. That's one thing you'll want to watch out for, and ask a merchant, how are you planning on doing this with your tips if we're going to talk about PIN debit. So why would a merchant want to decide to use PIN debit? Well, as I mentioned, it is growing. All right, we've already got the folks out there holding those debit cards, but you're starting to see more customers put that PIN number in and utilize that form of payments. It's faster, for one thing. When you think about, do I have to sign my name to a receipt, or do I just punch in 4 numbers for my PIN number? It can be faster. It's another reason why merchants like it too. I mean, if they are used to having long lines of customers, they might want that PIN pad in place. And when things get a little hairy, they get a little busy, they might ask their customers, go ahead and put your PIN number in and we can go ahead and skip the signature. And there's other ways around skipping that signature, but this might be a way to do that while still keeping those transactions pretty secure there. Cashback is also a feature available here. So you do see PIN debit being very popular with convenience stores and grocery stores. But really, I mean, any merchant that is accepting PIN debit today can offer that feature, cashback.
But you said not if they're going to use the money for tips?
Oh, I mean, well, if they're a restaurant and they want to do cash back and then use that money for tips, that could be done. Sure. I mean, just realize though, if it's a restaurant, they're probably going to want to make sure if they're going to offer that to their customers to make sure they have a wide variety of bills to offer for that cash back. Because you might have a customer who will come in and say, I want to get cash back off this PIN debit transaction, but I want that cash back to be, 10 ones, 2 5s, so that I could leave like a $4 tip or whatever it might be. So, yeah, these are just one of those things you want to advise a merchant. But, a restaurant could do it that way, sure. So PIN debit transactions, whenever they're being processed, and you guys probably saw something like this earlier in the week with the interchange presentation of what happens when a credit card transaction is swiped, where does it go, who sees that information. PIN debit is similar to that with, I think, one major difference, and that one major difference is what really affects the pricing. It starts off very much the same, all right? Customer and merchant together. And in the case of PIN debit, the merchant does have to be face-to-face with the merchant, all right? The customer really should be there to put in that PIN number for their card. They are the only ones that should know that PIN number in the first place. Now, once that transaction takes place, all right, it comes to us, right? We'll be able to see that transaction as it's coming through, and we can determine if it's a PIN or non-PIN debit transaction, just like any other transaction that the merchant might be accepting today. Here's where the major difference occurs, though. We don't pass this along to Visa and MasterCard. They don't even know this transaction exists. Even if the Visa or MasterCard logo is on the card itself, when that customer puts in their PIN number, this transaction is then going to be routed to one of the debit networks, okay? Now, we don't have any control over where that transaction gets routed through the debit networks, but the merchants can have control over that. So if a merchant has a particular debit network that they prefer to have routed, they just let customer service know, and that's something that's set up on the back end. Most merchants out there probably aren't going to care which debit network there are, and these aren't the only ones that you see listed here. These are just a few, but there's about a dozen different debit networks out there. If you look on the back of your debit cards, you'll probably see 2 or 3 of them on there. As most banks out there, what they'll do is they'll partner with the debit networks to say, if I have a customer, depending on where they're at in the world, where they want to run the transaction, this should be widely accepted no matter where they are. We support almost all of the debit networks that are out there today, but having that customer put that PIN number in and routing it to the debit networks, what that does is that doesn't allow Visa and MasterCard, Discover, American Express to apply their interchange costs to this transaction. The debit networks then are going to bill us, and then we're going to pass that along to the merchant. Now, the debit networks do have interchange themselves, but the interchange is much, much less than what you would typically see with any credit card transaction out there today. And in that way, when we bill the merchants from our end, we typically bill them on a per transaction fee, okay? So you'll see in the boarding piece, and later on in the week when we review over the MPA and roll-up, when you're setting up PIN debit, a lot of times you're going to be either doing the bundled debit option, or you're just going to be setting up a transaction fee, which says, for every one of your PIN debit transactions, you're going to get billed from us, whatever it might be, 20, 25 cents, 30 cents, whatever it might be, okay? Now, if the customer runs that debit card and doesn't put their PIN number in, well, that routes it like a credit card, all right? It's going to go through, very much the similar flow, but Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, they're going to be able to apply their interchange to those transactions because that PIN number is not entered and it's not being routed over those debit networks.
I'm sorry, I keep interrupting.
Oh, go ahead.
I have another question. When you keep saying that the customer, it sounds like they have an option of entering them.
Even though these transactions are being routed through the debit networks, they still end up pretty much at the end of the line at the issuing bank, whatever bank issued that card, and that decision will be made, right, as approve or decline, and then that'll get passed right back down to the merchant through the debit network, through us, all right, and then we got that response, and this all happens within about 3 to 5 seconds for the merchant. Putting that PIN number in doesn't slow things down at all. It actually speeds things up if you think about it, but the merchant or the customer are going to get that response as approval or decline. And typically whenever we get a decline here, that's the final word. I was actually at Home Depot the other day, and we had a credit card, my wife and I, that we hadn't activated yet. And when they swiped the card, it came up as declined. I'm like, oh, we just need to call in and activate it. But the clerk said, well, hold on, let me see if there's anything that we can do here. And I'm, being part of the industry, I'm like, I know exactly what's going to happen. You can't do anything about it. And in the case of a debit card, it's doubly so, I think, that you get a decline, that's it. All right. If there's any questions that need to be answered, typically merchant's going to direct that customer to their bank and say, I don't really have any control over this, why it's declining. You need to reach out to your bank to find out why. So PIN versus non-PIN debit, a quick rundown, a comparison, and I'm not going to hit on all of these. These will be here for you guys to kind of review over, but I think the big things that you want to review over with your merchants are, first of all, there's hardware requirements if you want to do PIN debit. So it may sound great, it may lower overall cost, but there is that equipment aspect to look at. PIN-based debit, it will require specific equipment, either an internal PIN pad built in to that piece of equipment or a separate PIN pad to do so, whereas non-PIN debit, you typically don't need any special equipment to do that. I mean, if your regular credit card acceptance is there, you'll be able to accept your non-PIN debit transactions there as well. Typically, debit is a fee-based transaction, as I mentioned, and we'll see that on our boarding tools, whereas non-PIN debit, as we mentioned, there's processing fees, rates and fees that are very similar to what you see for credit card transactions. PIN debit has a lower rate of chargebacks. It doesn't eliminate it altogether, but it does make it tougher for a customer to come in and dispute a transaction, saying, I didn't authorize this transaction, whenever we get that customer put in their PIN number. It makes it a little tougher for that customer to say it wasn't me whenever you're the only one who should know what that PIN number is. Whereas with non-PIN debit, just like credit card transactions, you still will have those disputes because there's really no extra level of authentication at the time of the transaction like we see with PIN debit there. As we saw earlier on the previous slide, transaction routes through the debit networks as opposed to the credit networks. And that makes that big change or that big difference between, is there a really true interchange cost or is it, a fee-based transaction there? Now, something that happened, let's see, that was October of, wow, we don't even have the date on here. It's been a few years. Time flies in this business, but point is, a few years ago, you guys may have heard of this, the Frank Dodd regulation or the Durbin Amendment. This changed our environment of debit a little bit, all right, but not so much with us. It changed it more for the issuing banks. Out there in the world today, there are debit cards from both regulated and unregulated banks. And the criteria that they use to determine whether or not a bank is regulated or not is, how much are they worth? What do they have? Regulated banks are merchants that have more than $10 billion in assets, all right? And they're a little bit more restricted on how much they can charge us interchange-wise on those debit transactions. Okay? Whereas unregulated banks, those are the issuing banks that have $10 billion and less in assets, and they actually continue to charge very close to those normal interchange rates when it comes to debit transactions. Now, for the regulated banks, those are the ones that we typically need to focus more of our attention on as far as, understanding this more. What happened with those regulated banks is that they were restricted on how much they could charge for a debit transaction. You see down below, here's what it currently is set at today. It's 0.05% or 5 basis points and 22 cents, okay? And that's regardless if it's PIN debit or non-PIN debit. If a merchant is receiving transactions from one of these regulated banks, this is their interchange starting cost. Or at least that's our cost that we start at. When this was introduced, a lot of our folks on our end said, well, what are we going to do about this? And our finance department said, we don't have to do anything. Just because the interchange lowered on these type of transactions doesn't mean we have to change our pricing. Now, since then, of course, with the competition out there focusing on this a little bit more, you've got different pricing options that are available. But I do still get a lot of questions about this. What do we do about this 5 basis points and 22 cents? Aren't we going to do something about this? Well, it really wasn't affecting us nearly as much as it was the issuing banks. I don't know if you remember back whenever this was released, but you had some of these larger banks saying, oh, well, you're going to cut our revenue off from here. We're going to start charging our customers a $5 usage fee a month for their debit cards. And, well, the consumers spoke up and said, go for it, because if you do, we're going to cut our cards up and take our business elsewhere. And that's why some of the larger banks kind of backed off and said, all right, we're just going to have to kind of accept this, as part of doing business out there. We can't continue to charge the processors like we used to, okay? For us, what this did, like I said, is it just offered us, it allowed us to give them a different option to when we're determining our pricing. The tough thing about this, though, this aspect of regulated versus unregulated, is it's very tough to predict what a merchant's going to see day in and day out, week after week, month after month, of regulated versus unregulated cards. I mean, you could look at a statement and you could see, last month they saw more regulated than unregulated, but that doesn't tell you what's going to happen over the next few months. So you may hear some information about this as merchants become more aware of this. They're probably already very much aware of this, but new merchants that are out there and just getting started might hear about this. And just realize, when it comes to pricing, you guys have a lot of flexibility that you'll learn about. You've already learned about, pricing exceptions yesterday, but you'll also learn more about, pricing options as you go. And this will be one of those big ones that you'll want to take a look at. This presentation has some examples of that in it as well. Okay. PIN debit transactions from unregulated banks are charged debit network fees, access fees, and transaction fees. Non-PIN debit transactions from unregulated banks are charging non-PIN debit interchange rate and fees. But once again, from regulated banks, it's that 5 basis points and 22 cents, and that's all they're allowed to charge us. As agents, what this does is this gives you a lot more wiggle room when you're deciding your pricing, especially with PIN debit, to determine your profitability. It gives us more opportunity to be profitable and competitive at the same time. Okay. PIN debit fees on the MPA. All right, so here's a quick glimpse. You'll see this again, like I said, later on in the week. With PIN debit, if a merchant wants to be able to start accepting these types of transactions, there is a $5 monthly fee, and then there is a transaction fee. All right, usually the standard transaction fee starts at 25 cents per transaction. And that's up to you guys to determine. You want to make it higher than that. If you want to go lower than that, you guys can determine your pricing there. But 25 cents per transaction is usually where we start. Now, when it comes to billing for the merchant, that 25 cents is not the only thing the merchant will see on their statement. That's our pricing. The debit networks are also going to get their money out of this as well, kind of like the credit card companies. They will, the credit brands will get their interchange. Debit will get theirs as well. But in some cases, it may be, even with the debit network fees and our cost, it may be cheaper for the merchant to have their customers put that PIN debit number in as opposed to letting it go through credit. Okay, the higher the transaction, average ticket might be, that benefit becomes more prevalent. Okay, and you'll see in the boarding piece that we do also offer the ability for cashback, so merchants can determine, what's their cashback limit. There's no mention here of what that limit is, but the typical amount is $100. And I think that's probably what you see in most merchants that offer today. You can get 20, 40, 60, 80, and $100. But once again, the merchants can determine what those cashback limits will be. All right, we can offer that service there as well. So what kind of questions might you ask a merchant if they are interested in getting set up with PIN debit, or if you're trying to discover if PIN debit is going to be a good option for this merchant? Well, you might look at, well, how might the speed factor help this merchant? Whenever you have long lines, what are you doing? How are you helping getting those customers through the lines? How many nights a week do you find yourself, where you've got a long line of customers and some of the customers are leaving? They're putting the product back on the shelf and they're leaving because the line's just not moving fast enough. How do customers currently pay? All right, might be a good question. I started this conversation off today with that very question, and that applies to all the topics that we're going to cover today. Is what are you currently accepting, and how can we fill the gaps, with things that you aren't accepting? Because when you're not accepting those forms of payment, you're eliminating customers that want to pay that way. You never want to do that as a business owner. Would you be interested in minimizing the cost of your debit transactions? That goes towards that pricing aspect, but it's a different approach, right? It's not saying I'm going to lower your rates. I'm going to show you a different way to accept those transactions. Right? It might require some additional hardware, but in certain situations, like if you have a merchant who has, an average ticket above $75, for example, it's in the long run, it's going to be beneficial for that merchant to start asking for that PIN number, or at least be able to provide that, when they're looking to, if you have a merchant who's really looking to save money there. Chargebacks are also another piece to look at. A lot of times merchants are charged or billed a chargeback fee. We do it. So, if a merchant says, well, I'm losing money, and it's not because of a few basis points on my rate or a few cents on my transaction fee, but it's these chargebacks. I get a lot of these disputes. How do I change that? This might be that opportunity. It doesn't eliminate chargebacks, but PIN debit can help cut that back.
Can you explain how PIN debit would make your wait in line shorter? I don't follow that.
Would make your what? I'm sorry? We talked about the chargebacks, decreasing amount of time the merchant spent to cash register. That kind of ties back to that first bullet point and that great question, about, well, how will that save time? Now, there are programs in place, of course, with retailers that, under a certain dollar amount, they don't have to get a signature anyway. But once again, it really depends on the business. If they're a larger ticket item, they have longer lines, PIN debit could definitely help there, as opposed to signing for a transaction, putting that 4-digit number. You're going to spit out 2 receipts. Merchant gets one, customer gets one, and they can get them out the door a little bit faster and get to the next customer in line. What about selling strategies for debit? Well, here's some scenarios. There's a couple scenarios that we put in here that we can take a look at as to why, when would we maybe offer debit and why. So this first scenario here, we've got potential client has a medium-based clothing boutique with a demographic of females ages 16 to 25. Average ticket's somewhere between $200 and $500, and she currently is only accepting cash and credit card transactions. So one of the first questions we might look at with this business is, what do you know about this type of business? What do we know? Well, we've got some stuff in here that we can already highlight and take with us. First of all, medium-sized clothing boutique. And I'm sorry for the color there. I decided to use that for my highlighter there. But a clothing store, all right? Usually whenever you have a clothing store, people want to come in and try those things on, all right? They want to be able to see if it fits right. You can buy clothing online, but if you have the option to buy it online or actually go to the store to try it on, most consumers will want that face-to-face interaction. So that puts the customer in our store, which means, okay, they're here with us. Pandemic could be a reality. Next, let's look at the demographic, all right? A demographic of females ages 16 to 25, all right? Now, I'm looking at the lower end of that scale, 16, 17. A lot of these consumers, their first form of plastic and owning a card is going to be a debit card, all right? They're getting their first jobs. They're most likely setting up a bank account anyway because where they're working wants to do direct deposit, and they're usually going to get that debit card from their bank to say, well, here's how you have access to your funds. So you've got the right consumers in place that probably have those cards, all right? They probably already have those cards in their possession, all right? And then the last thing that I take a look at here for this type of merchant is their average ticket, all right, between $200 and $500. This is where we could work with this merchant potentially talking about the cost benefits of asking for that PIN number. With an average ticket, like I said, it's usually right around that $75 to $100. If you're getting around that range of an average ticket with a merchant, asking a customer to put in their PIN number with them being only billed, you know, a debit transaction fee from the debit networks and us, it could be less than what, you know, Visa and MasterCard are going to want to charge interchange-wise, which, of course, translate over to what we're going to price that at. But it could be a cheaper transaction. The higher the average ticket, the better the benefit there, okay? And really, I mean, you know, a fourth thing that you would look at here is, you know, what are they accepting today? You know, they're accepting cash, credit cards, and checks. They've already got the credit cards there, so chances are they've already got a device that they can swipe cards in. We may only be talking a very minor addition to this merchant's environment or their hardware by introducing a PIN pad. All right, so some things to take a look at, you know, if you ever run across a merchant like this, and it helps us kind of hone in on, you know, what are some of those telling signs that this merchant would be a good fit. Average ticket, the types of customers that they see, and where they interact with their customers. Those will be some things that will definitely clue you in there. What about this next scenario? All right, I'll let you guys take a look over this real quick. And
wait. I'm sorry, it's Heather again. What about the demographic? What about it? Is
the age range in there? Yeah, it has nothing to do with the fact that they're females. It could be males, but the age range is what I would be looking at there. As, you know, at the age of 16, most states today, I know at least in Pennsylvania, I can't get a job until I'm at the age of 16, and most of those first jobs, most of those businesses are probably going to be paying their employees by direct deposit. You know, they're going to ask those employees to have a bank account set up so they can deposit those funds directly. And as an employee, you know, I get my bank account set up. I'm most likely going to get, you know, a debit card and possibly a checking account set up so that those funds can be deposited directly. And this will be their first form of plastic. I know whenever I was starting out, we got paper paychecks. But nowadays, more employers out there are saying, no, we're going to do away with paper. We're going to direct deposit. It's cheaper for us, And, that demographic, it's like, oh, I've got my first real card. It's mine. It's my fund. I'm going to pay for it. Yeah. So the same applies for college, too. I think a lot of college students, you'll find, if you have businesses around large college towns or college campuses, you have the same scenario there where kids are going off to school, mom and dad are putting money into that bank account so they can spend it on books and hopefully not anything questionable, but you've got that demographic of consumers out there that have that card already. And so it only makes sense, let's make sure we're preparing the business for that consumer that's probably going to have that card already. All right, we're not really asking the customer to do much.
Is there a resource that has demographics and types of payments they prefer that we can refer to?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if Visa and MasterCard have any demographics on debit. Issuing banks or the debit networks, they might. That's a good question. I can look into that for you to see if there's any any statistics out there that show who's using debit cards today. But yeah, just kind of using that mentality of there's most of your folks there in that age range are probably going to be carrying that debit card. It's pretty reliable. I can find out for you others, see if there's any statistics out there. You can walk into a merchant and say, hey, studies have been done. Your customers are in this age range. They'll probably carry a debit card, so you should probably consider it. It's good information you want to have with you. Yeah. Good questions, Heather. Good questions. Keep them coming. Here's scenario number 2, all right? And I will tell you that with scenario number 2, there's not a lot of information here for us to go on. We've got a potential client owns a small hardware store in an established neighborhood, average ticket of $25. Not a lot of information that we have here. There's probably things that we're going to still want to ask, like what forms of payment do they accept today? But this is a good scenario of where you may not bring debit up right away. You're probably going to have to ask some more questions here. Average ticket doesn't seem like it's high enough that the cost benefit's going to be there. They do have the face-to-face business most likely, but they might have a website where that PIN debit becomes a little bit more difficult. And we don't have a defined demographic here. With a hardware store, it's all over the place. Young, old, male, female. But the thing we might ask this merchant is, is speed of getting the customer through the line an issue, or disputes, chargebacks? All right.
If there's a hurricane warning, there is in Florida, right? Yeah.
Yeah. That will cause some folks to run out to the hardware store and get that plywood. Absolutely. You're a good point, Heather.
Saving your community
bring
with
that one up
PIN
for this scenario. So yeah. What's that?
I said saving your community with PIN pads.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah, get you through the line faster so you can get home and get that stuff up. All right. Now, there's also some scenarios in here that will run down, when is it a good time to talk about the different options here, depending on the merchants. Do you use blended pricing or split pricing? You guys talked about that yesterday with Lana. Do I combine the credit and debit rates or not? A lot of this is going to be asking your merchant, some questions, taking a look at statements as well. But, on statements, not looking at just the rates and fees, but, can you see what this merchant typically sees as far as customers? Do we see a lot of non-PIN debit versus debit? Do we see regulated versus unregulated debit happening here? So, you can use these strategies to, when it comes to pricing, determine which is the best route here. And a lot of this is, when you see down the rates and fees here, a lot of this is what we consider standard pricing, and you don't have to write a pricing exception to work with these, all right? But, it all depends. If a merchant sees a lot of regulated debit, for example, basing your pricing closely to that, 0.05 and 22 cents, might give you the best benefit, all right? But you're going to have to look at a statement to determine that. I bet you if you ask a merchant, do you see more regulated versus unregulated debit, they're going to say, what? What debit? What did you say? I just accept the cards, and if it says it's approved, then I'm good with it, But if you're doing a cost analysis, these things will help, The blended pricing versus swipe pricing, split pricing might be a better option if the merchant does see more debit cards and you're planning on doing tiered pricing. Okay, that's where split and blended really come into play. If you're doing that tiered pricing, but some merchants out there, they'll get offers from competitors showing really great low rates, like something that we see here, like this $139.25. And so, you might walk into a merchant location and they might pull out that flyer and say, well, can you match this? And that's where we might need to take a closer look as, well, what is this really offering? What is this rate referring to? You might see it on that flyer somewhere in a small print, or you may actually have to contact that competitor, or your merchant might have to contact them and ask, what's that 1.39 and 25 cents? And that might be where you find out, oh, that's our debit rate. All right, that's where we start with our debit transaction. So information like this is good to know how you're going to strategize with your pricing. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap up with review. We're here at the top of our hour. We're kind of wrapping up our call here on debit, but let's get interactive here. Let's use some annotation tools here. We didn't do this much yesterday with our two topics, as there really wasn't much of an opportunity to be interactive there. But now we're getting into our products and services. I'm going to ask you a few things here, and I will take the first person that uses the raise hand icon here. For that first question, what are the two types of debit transactions? Oh, I saw Heather. Okay. Heather, what are the two types of debit transactions?
PIN and non-PIN.
PIN and non-PIN. And what's another term you might hear for non-PIN? It's a bonus question for you.
How do I put my hand down?
Yeah. Can anybody else on the call help Heather out? What's another term that you might use for non-PIN debit?
Swiped.
You don't have to. Yeah. If you don't know how to raise your hand, oh, I see. Andregas, what do you have there for us, Andregas? Make sure you unmute your line there. I'll unmute it for you. There you go.
Oh.
What's another term? Can you help Heather out?
Is it signature debit?
You got it. Yes. Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Yay.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, signature debit and non-PIN debit are usually pretty synonymous with each other. All right, excellent. Thank you, guys, for the answers there and helping out there, Andreas. Second question: How many agents benefit from selling PIN debit? So, what's in it for me? Let's hear from somebody else here on the call. If you want to jump in there, you don't have to necessarily raise your hand, but if you want to jump in and just give me two benefits of why an agent will want to offer PIN debit. John or Andrew, you guys have any thoughts on that? Oh, John, you got your hand raised. What do you have for us? John, are you speaking? You have your line on mute?
I'm trying to talk here. Yeah, I'm trying to talk to you. Do you hear me? Okay. You got me? How about, okay. How about selling more hardware? PIN pads.
Yeah, that's definitely hardware sales, sure. Anything else there? All right. Well, you do get revenue from PIN debit transactions, so there's that aspect that rolls into your residual income. All right.
Right.
You also have the aspect of being that all-in-one solution for your merchants, hopefully helping retain those merchants against your competitors. Absolutely. So a couple benefits there. All right, and then the last one, in the interest of time, as we're kind of wrapping up here, and we do have another call coming up shortly, list some probing questions you could ask a potential client to discover PIN debit. It could be the average ticket aspect, the demographic of their consumers. You could ask them about their chargeback. So one of the different ways that you could approach a merchant, it's usually a very simple product offering. There aren't too many people out there that don't know what debit is. It's just how do you let your merchants know what the benefit to them is? After that, then they get it. I think it's like, oh, okay, so that's the benefit. Now I need a PIN pad. Okay, how do I get that? And then, okay, I'll start asking my customers to put in their PIN number, whether it's transaction-wise or if I'm going to try to cut back on my potential chargebacks or disputes there. There's benefits for us, and there's definitely benefits for the merchant. And it might be a cost thing, too. So that's where we can let them know about their average, with their average ticket, asking their customers to put in their PIN number. All right? Well, thank you guys for joining this session. Now, the presentation that we covered today, it is, once again, in the handouts for you to download, so please feel free to take that along with you. If you're not sure how to do that, if you joined the call a little later, or this is the first call you've joined in our new agent development this week, as I mentioned at the top of the call, there's a window that may have opened up for you. It says File Transfer. If that has gone away and you don't see it anymore, here's how you get back to it. In the upper left-hand corner of the WebEx, you click on File and then go down to Transfer. All right, you should see the handout there, the document that you can download. The remaining slides in the presentation are an appendix, if you will, and it just kind of speaks to the differences between bundled debit and unbundled debit. So they'll be there for you guys to look over. They'll help, once again, help you decide on how do you want to approach a merchant strategy-wise with your pricing. I will say that most agents out there usually do the unbundled debit. They just do the credit and the debit separately, and then have the debit with the PIN debit with a transaction fee. But that is up to you guys to determine. All right, if you guys which route you want to go there. So, all right. Any other questions that I can help out with before we wrap up this call? And if there aren't any questions, I'll go ahead and close things up and give you guys a little bit of a break between now and our next call. But are there any questions I can help